The New South Wales SES and the state government and all emergency services are currently running a campaign called Get Ready. What that means is we're asking residents to get ready for the storm, the flood, the fire, pretty much any type of emergency. It's about understanding the risk and actually taking ownership for the risk for wherever you are. We might not be able to get to certain communities. Basically, it's about knowing your risk, identifying that early, having a plan in place, and if you need to, implement that plan to get to safety before it occurs. Local communities know their local geography and topography the best, and generally they can identify when it's going to flood, and even if it's going to flood, a lot before emergency services can, because that local community effect has the best way of keeping communities safe. If you're in a property that gets inundated, then generally you'll be under what we call an evacuation warning or an evacuation order. You're going to lose power, you're going to lose your phone lines, mobile phone networks are unreliable, sewage is going to get backed up, and potentially any water is going to be contaminated, not even by sewage, but the chemicals you keep in your shed. So we don't like to keep people in their properties if it becomes inundated. If you're just going to be isolated, for example, the road into town gets cut and you're high and dry, well above the PMF flood level, and we encourage you, well before an event occurs, to stock up on supplies so that you're self-sufficient for however many days the event's going to last for. So we've had a slogan recently called "If it's flooded, forget it." And the basic pretense is, if you see floodwaters across a road, forget driving through it because it is dangerous. A lot of people don't know that just 30 centimetres of flowing water is enough to wash a vehicle off a road. They can't see what's under the floodwaters. They don't even know if the road's under the floodwaters. And a lot of the rescues that we did conduct in the recent event were for people who had driven through a very small amount of floodwater and had been washed off and downstream. Most cars aren't built to drive through floodwaters, and a lot of people do get stuck, and it kept the organisation very busy. When we issue an evacuation order, a lot of people think, oh, it's not going to be that bad. The SES are overdoing it and overreacting, and they tend to stay behind. And what we find is they stay behind and for the first few hours they think, oh, this is not going to last that long, but then it goes for 12 hours, 24 hours and a couple of days, and they're stuck in their house, everything's soaked, there's 1 metre or 2 metres of water through their property. They've got no food because their fridge doesn't work. In fact, their fridge is probably flooded, so all their food's been contaminated. The garden lawnmower fuel is all through their property. The sewage is backed up, so the water is disgusting, it's dirty, there's debris. A lot of the times when our own rescuers go into floodwaters, they have to come out and get decontaminated because they're just, who knows what they're covered in. A lot of emergency responders get sick after being in floodwaters because of the contaminants that flow into their bodies. So it's not a nice place to be, and it'd be nice not only for their safety but for our own safety if more of the community listened to particularly the evacuation orders and actually got out of the area before they needed rescuing.
Because the Shoalhaven is such a large area and so separated from itself, we essentially have to learn how to look after ourselves, because the SES won't be able to get to everybody. So we can tell communities that your house is impacted, and therefore that person, that individual, can plan themselves what they're going to do in the time of a flood. They can have their flood plan ready, even if your house isn't inundated. So are you prepared? Do you have your flood emergency kit available that has those supplies, that has your torches, the batteries, medication, food for your family, food for your pets? They're the things that individuals can do prior to a flood and be prepared, so that if they do get isolated, they don't need to depend on anybody else. They'll be okay because they've looked after themselves.
The earliest floods we have records of in the Shoalhaven is in 1857, and it caused stock losses and crop losses, and people had to evacuate, but not too catastrophic. Then in 1860, there were 4 floods in 1 year. The first of those floods caused huge damage at Numbar and Terrera. The contemporary reports from the newspapers say that Numbar was basically washed away, the whole town. Large parts of Terrera were washed away. Many people evacuated to Nowra and then moved back after that event. Flooding is also often quite clustered. We have wet periods, we have drought periods. During drought periods, flood memory disappears. People forget that places flood. They move back to places like Terrera because it's a really nice view. Living with flood is a reality. We choose to occupy floodplains for good reasons. The community can safely occupy many parts of most floodplains, and the process I assist councils to implement is one that allows people to identify and occupy safe areas of floodplains and live with floods. The other thing we do in the floodplain risk management studies and document in the plans, we look at what options they've got, where they can evacuate to, when they can evacuate, and having a flood plan that they implement themselves. This is an excellent opportunity to actually engage with people and build their flood resilience. Get them engaged in planning what they will do to respond, so they don't just rely on council or the State Emergency Service coming and rescuing them.